Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. In a moment, I'm going to be handing over to Russell Critchley and Graham Morgan. They're both from, Russell is from Deadwood and Graham is from the SLIM Woodlands CIC. You'll hear a bit more about their organisations a little bit later. This talk tonight is a change of speaker. We were supposed to have Nick Marshall, but he was unable to attend. So we are very delighted to have Russell and Graham with us and saved us last minute, really. This is CPRE Shropshire's last hedgerow talk for this phase. This will highlight how woodlands can be managed to enhance biodiversity and how hedgerows, trees and ponds and other natural connections can improve wildlife movement across the landscape. Before I hand over to our fantastic speakers, I'm just going to give a few call outs from CPRE Shropshire. So if you want to view any of the past talks, you can head over to our website where all of the links will be made available for us as long as we really can. They'll be on YouTube at some stage as well, so they will be definitely available. If you'd like to help us help the countryside, you can become a member. You can do this by visiting cpre.org.uk/get involved. And to find out how to donate to our local branch here in Shropshire, you can go to justgiving.com/CPRE Shropshire. You can also catch us at some future events. What have we got coming up? We are going to be at the Clun Green Man on the 2nd of May. We're going to be at the Regenerative Farming Conference on the 6th of May. That's in Norbury Village Hall. And we'll be at the Lillishall Fete on the 5th of June and the Green Fair in Ludlow in July. That's just to name a few events where you'll be able to find us. All of this detail will be on our website, of course. And lastly, just to share with you some exciting news, CPRE Shropshire has been awarded some funding for phase 2 of our hedgerow project, which means we can create more hedgerows across the Shropshire landscape, put on more hedge laying training sessions, do more engagement with schools, walks and talks. So watch this space, really. We are at this very moment in time looking for new landowners and farmers across the whole of Shropshire. So if you've got any contact details of anyone, please get in touch with us. We would really, really like to work with you. And if you've got any questions on any of what I've just said, not to worry, you can contact us by either going to our website, cpre.org.uk, or you can email us at admin@cpreshropshire.org.uk, or you can call us on 01547 528 546. Not to worry if you missed any of that, because I will jot it in the chat as we go along. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Graham Morgan at this point, who's going to be our first guest speaker for this evening.
Hello, thank you. Yes, thanks to CPRE for inviting me along to give a talk this evening. It's always a pleasure to talk about woodlands, and it's always a pleasure to talk and discuss woodlands with people. I love going on little journeys with people, hearing them talk about their woodlands. So it's very much a pleasure for me to be here tonight. I will just do a screen share and bring my presentation. Hopefully everyone can see that. So a little bit about me before we get into it proper. So I am a coppice worker and a forestry worker, chartered environmental scientist, ecologist and environmental planner, and I started out life 20 odd years ago as a junior ecologist, travelling the length and breadth of the country, doing surveys for wildlife, writing management plans, writing species mitigation plans, that kind of thing, in a development context for all sorts of developments across the country, including wind farms and overhead power lines and residential things, that kind of thing, and dabbled a little bit in woodlands and forestry, and then probably about 6 years ago wanted to kind of get back to something more hands-on, where I had sort of a greater relationship with the people and the places that I was involved with and the work I was doing. So I started getting into forestry more formally, and I set up my own company 4 years ago, the SLIM Woodlands CIC, which is a social enterprise community incorporated company. And I basically help people manage their woodlands, particularly people with small woodlands, helping them to get access to grant money, write management plans, get thinning licenses, and planning applications through for forestry buildings and new roads, that kind of thing, to help them manage their woodlands. And so I generally, when I'm out and about, sorry, my screen has frozen. So I'm just going to see what's going on here. Try that again. There we go. Slight hiccup. There we go. So if when I'm not in the office writing a management plan, I'm out and about with my bill hook and my chainsaw, having a whale of a time. No, that's a word of a lie. I'm usually sweating, swearing, getting thoroughly dirty, and having a great time usually. So I make hurdles as a coppice worker, traditional woven style or framed hurdles, and I also do thinning and fell trees, that kind of thing, just generally practical woodland management stuff. Absolutely love it. Most of the work I do practically wise is over the winter, and I just love that great water bouncing off your head, you know, when it's belting down with rain, and then you get home and you have a nice hot bath and reflect on the day. So yeah, I just love it. So I think I'd like to start with sort of a quick question to you, or before we get going, when we've just run through this. So plants and animals, what do we mean? There's various different ways you can describe plants and animals. Biodiversity, is it nature, is it wildlife? They all mean slightly different things, but this talk I'm going to focus on the conservation of woodland biodiversity, which is everything that's native and naturalised, so it's not non-invasive. Anything that's non-invasive or non-domesticated I wouldn't count as woodland biodiversity. So it's biological organisms that are native and naturalised, whether they're generalist or specialist. And I've got a quick question for you all. You don't need to shout out now, but have in your head. It'd be I'm playing devil's advocate slightly with the answers here, but it'd be interesting for you to know what you think now, and then at the end of the session tonight. So if you could do one thing to help woodland biodiversity, what would it be? Would it be no management at all, so just leave the woodland alone to do its own thing? Would it be to fell some trees in an existing woodland? Would it be to stick up a bird box? Or would it be to plant some more trees to create more woodland? So if you ponder that question for a second, I'll leave that slide there for a wee moment, and then I will move over. We're going to come back to that at the end, so don't worry too much. So yeah, examples of woodland wildlife. I suppose, like me, when I started out doing ecology 25 years ago, whatever, I looked at a conifer plantation and just went, "Ooh, horrible things." But they too can have their own little specialisms of wildlife that hang on to them. But I mean, generally speaking, yes, ancient semi-natural woodland is the classic woodland that we aspire to, I guess. Particularly this time of year, lots of bluebells everywhere. It's very green and bright and vibrant, isn't it? And a whole range of species there, whether in this example, pearl-bordered fritillary on some common spotted orchid, or dormice. You know, I could be here all night with various different species, but conifer plantations, quite a different beast. I wouldn't say they were particularly biodiverse, but again, they can still have specialist species adapted to them that do very well in them. Sorry, red squirrel, for example, nightjar, you know, goshawk. We could name some others. So it's not such a cut and dry picture as you would imagine. But I think particularly this time of year, when you're walking around and you hear the birds tweeting, the butterflies are flying around and the flowers are out, it's very easy to sort of get lulled into a false sense of security that everything's okay, but it really isn't. There really is a biodiversity and a climate emergency, and the two are interlinked. I was the chair of the policy working group for England for the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management a few years ago. And one of the things I did was to help them release this climate emergency declaration. So for those of you not familiar with this organisation, they are the professional body that represents ecologists and environmental managers, and a very prominent organisation. Does a lot of lobbying for good things with government. And yeah, we released this declaration to basically say, you know, we need a call to action. Things are not very well when it comes to ecology and the environment, particularly biodiversity tied in with climate change. Also at the same time, the RSPB and the State of Nature Partnership released a report where they examined, I think, 8,500 species, so data for 8,500 species over 50 years from 1970, and basically came to the conclusion that most species are declining, basically. Biodiversity in the UK really isn't in good condition at all. In most cases, a few species are doing quite well, but generally on the whole, most are declining. And in fact, you know, since the 1970s, I think we've lost 2% of species have gone extinct in my lifetime. You know, that's 170 species, so that's really is quite worrying. Moving on to UK woodland, so honing in a bit more from, if you like, general biodiversity. So again, these are from this data is from various sources, the Forestry Commission, and the State of Nature reports and Natural England. But you can see in this graph here that if 1970 is the baseline start year, you know, that's dropped by, well, getting on for, you know, 38, 40%, something like that. You know, 30 odd percent, probably like that up to now. The same for butterflies as well. That's dropped, although it is starting to rise in the short term. Generally, the long term picture is still decline. And this one's for plants, and I'm not quite sure why it only goes back to 2015. I think it's something to do with the way the surveys had changed. But essentially, you know, plants have not been doing very well even more recently. And all of these reports, and it's widely agreed amongst people in the profession that the decline of woodland species is mainly due to lack of woodland management or lack of appropriate woodland management. There are a number of other factors as well, but that is the main driver of species decline in woodlands. So a few questions that arise, I guess, out of that, which is, you know, why is this a problem for biodiversity? You know, surely cutting down trees is a bad thing for wildlife. Shouldn't we just leave woodlands alone and stop interfering with them? Generally, when people hear chainsaws going off, they get quite nervous. So to kind of answer the questions, a brief fly back in time to 12,000 years ago or so, the sort of Middle Stone Age period, Mesolithic, when primary forests, so these are woodlands that by definition aren't affected by human activities to the degree where it affects the functions and the processes and of how the ecosystems work. So what we would call wildwoods, they still existed. Humans were sort of nibbling a little bit into them, but weren't doing anything too fundamental. This picture on the right here just kind of shows you the main types that were present at that time, and generally up to about the Midlands area. You can see it was predominantly lime was a very dominant species, and then you went further north, it became oak and hazel, and then in the far north sort of birch and pine, and then so that kind of continued up into about 6,000 years ago. And then what happened about 6,000 years ago is Neolithic humans, the late Stone Age, sort of started getting into agriculture, and started heavily intervening across the UK landscape in quite a big way, but particularly in woodlands. And you saw a switch from a dense, what you would call a high forest canopy, to a sort of mixed coppice situation where you know, you had a greater variability in physical and age structure. So something like what is on the right here, and that happened in a major way across the UK at the landscape scale en masse, for agriculture, and also a whole range of other hosts and uses. So humans starting to settle in one place as opposed to being hunter-gatherers and being nomadic. And then about 2,000 years ago, so the end of the Iron Age, all wildwoods start to disappear completely or are replaced by what we'd call sort of a managed secondary woodland, so being replaced by a different woodland type. So essentially going from older growth forests, so like on the left, to something like you see on the right. And so, therefore, for historical reasons, most UK woodland wildlife is adapted to active management, to humans intervening in woodlands. And there is quite a lot of debate. I'll be honest with you, in the archaeological community about whether humans were actively managing woodlands back then, or they were being a bit more opportunistic. But I don't think you can get around the fact that humans were intervening to quite a large degree. And with that management, in inverted commas, comes greater variation in light levels, age and physical structure, as opposed to everything being a similar age or just one thing. So quite a bit different to what it was before, when it was primary forest. So you can see there again, just that picture, that's quite different to a closed canopy, everything completely dense, dark, older growth. And to mention at this point, particularly because I'm currently living in this part of the world, down in the Forest of Dean, Wye Valley area, is Lady Park Wood, which is 36 hectares of ancient woodland, which pretty much has been unmanaged since 1944, and even some sections not managed since 1870. And it's worth having a look online for details about that if you're not familiar with it, because it's quite interesting. Basically, hasn't had any management done since that timescale, and some very interesting thoughts from George Peterkin, who wrote this book on what's happened to that woodland and why, and how that has a bearing on how we think about woodlands in the future. So that's a very interesting read. And so if we then move on to, so we kind of looked at the question, I tried to answer the question of why it's a problem for woodlands not being managed, and it's because they're woodlands and wildlife are adapted to a level of intervention, increased light levels. And in terms of how that pans out today, how woodlands are owned and managed, so most UK woodland is privately owned. And the management that's being undertaken is simply not known about, and it's not registered to a recognised standard. And so it's about 73% is privately owned of all woodland in the UK, so there's about 3.2 million hectares in the UK. So most of it's privately owned, and yeah, about 56% the management is simply unknown. It's not registered with the Forestry Commission as being to a particular standard. That doesn't mean that people aren't managing their woodlands in a good way, it's just that we don't know that they are. So we just simply don't know how many people actually are managing their woodlands to a good standard if they've not been registered. For England, it's a worse picture, I'm afraid, in that although more people own their woodlands in England than the UK as a whole, an even greater majority are managing their woodlands to an unknown standard. So 77% of woodlands in England are not being managed either at all or to a known standard of sustainability. So quite a worrying picture, really. So in terms of improving that situation, you may have heard of a organisation called the SLIM Foundation. Gabriel and Peter Orsley, Gabriel Emery there, doing some great stuff, some great research. They often do that. Well, every time there's what's called the British Woodland Survey, you may have had a go at having input into that, but that canvasses opinions around woodland owners every year or 2 years. They run that, and they do lots of other good stuff. But they invented this thing called the Woodland Wildlife Toolkit. There's a link there, and there will be a link in this presentation that you can follow at a later date, but that's really useful. You can pay someone like me to walk around the woodlands and get a really detailed picture. If cash is tight, and it certainly is this at the moment, particularly, then this is a good free way of getting a bit of a handle on what species might be in your woodland, and the kind of things you might want to think about doing to make them hang around a bit longer, or improve the situation for them. So you simply put in your woodland location, and it comes up with a list of species that might be there and what you can do. So this is just an example. There's a whole host of bats have come up here, and you can see on the right hand side there's a load of tick boxes against some key management actions that you can do to improve the situation for bats. So I mean, that's a great little toolkit there. I thoroughly recommend you have a go at that. It's very simple and easy to use. But in terms of the kind of actions you might want to take, there's a whole range of things you can do, but just a quick starter for the 10, as it were. Creation, maintenance of rides. A lot of rides I see when I go around woodlands are just overgrown and haven't been maintained, and they really do add variability to a woodland, as well as allowing you to actually get proper access into the woodland to do the management. So I think they are really, really important things to maintain. And in a similar fashion, creating and maintaining more open space, so glades, scallops in the woodland, all adds to the variability in the woodland, so it's not all the same thing. Creating or retaining standing and fallen deadwood, so having deadwood that's in the canopy as well as on the floor, obviously provided the deadwood isn't in a dangerous place, so overhanging a public right away, that kind of thing. But we definitely need more of that. Identifying sort of trees that either are ancient and veteran or could be in the future, and making sure that they are protected from harm, and undertaking what's called halo thinning, where you're essentially taking out anything that's interfering or interlaced with the canopy of that tree around it, so that it's got the space to carry on sort of breathing and getting on and doing what it's doing. Control of pests and non-native invasive species, so grey squirrel, rhododendron, non-native species of deer, and indeed, overpopulations of native deer species is a problem. Biosecurity measures, so keeping an eye out for and taking action against things like Ash Dieback. Phytophthora is currently raging around both our larch and Douglas fir, albeit they are non-native species, but they are, important timber species in this country. And so, keeping an eye out for those and taking measures if needs be. Installing bat and bird boxes, that's also a good thing to do. These two really, I think, are the main ones, and that is felling trees. Quite simply, selective felling small groups of trees, a certain number of trees, undertaking thinning operations. There simply isn't enough of that going on in most UK woodlands to create the age diversity and the physical diversity that the wildlife has become adapted to and needs to create a healthy woodland. Things just simply get left, everything becomes the same, and it really makes the woodland more vulnerable. And by opening up little areas, you can allow the soil bank to regenerate, and you will find that even without planting anything, the seed bank will respond, and you will get trees coming through, and that adds diversity to the canopy. And provided you protect that little area with maybe a little bit of temporary fencing to stop the deer nibbling the shoots in the first year or two, those trees will get away, and you'll be surprised what actually comes through. And if you need to do a bit of supplementary planting to put in a few species that you want to, then you can do. But those sort of two really are one of the key reasons why biodiversity is declining. There simply isn't enough kind of targeted and sensitive tree felling going on in woodlands to kind of keep things diverse. And just to reiterate that point, greater age, greater tree species, greater physical diversity is all good for biodiversity and contributes to what we call forest resilience. And if you don't know about forest resilience, please do go and look up that online. There's some really good stuff that I can point you in the direction of. So if you haven't picked up on the point, improving woodland biodiversity is good woodland management. This list that I've just gone through here, if you are managing your woodland correctly and you're managing it to the UK forestry standard, you would be doing this anyway as a matter of course. So if you get the woodland management right, the biodiversity will follow. And not only that, you will have a healthy woodland. So getting sort of towards the end of my presentation now, but what is wrong in this picture? It's a question to pose. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Maybe not a full minute, but a bit of time. It looks very even-aged. There's no understory. I appreciate it's autumn, and so you won't necessarily see the ground floor, but I can't see any deadwood in the canopy. I can't see any deadwood on the floor. It is quite young, admittedly, but it's very even aged and it just looks very boring, doesn't it? If you think about the earlier photo I showed, which was quite diverse, there was small stuff, there was big stuff, there was open space, tall trees, small trees. There was just lots going on, wasn't there? Whereas this, it's quite boring, really, isn't it? It's all the same thing. So we want less of this and we want more of the variability. And if you're really going to get stuck into this, I would thoroughly recommend that you do a woodland management plan and try and get it approved by the Forestry Commission. It really isn't actually that complicated. People like me can give you a bit of a helping hand, but there is actually a small woodland management plan template. And what that allows you to do is formalise your woodland management. So when you're talking about wanting to get people in to give you a hand, whether it's volunteers or forestry contractors, or you're trying to get planning permission or all those kind of things, get grant funding, it just means there's a standard way you can show people what you're intending to do, and it's really helpful. And it also helps you mark change in the woodland over time, so you can go back to your plan in 5 or 10 years and go, oh, actually, I can update this now. It's a really, really good thing. And also, and ultimately in the future, if somebody's buying your woodland or taking it over from you, they can see what your intention was 20, 30 years ago, and that's really, really helpful. Most woodlands that people take on these days, we simply don't know what the person was thinking 50 years ago when they planted something or were doing some management, and that's not very helpful, because we have to manage woodlands on a long time scale. 50 to 100 years is the kind of time scales we're looking at here to make lasting change. And if you're going to do that, that means you're managing your woodland in accordance with the UK Forestry Standard, which is the benchmark standard that everyone should be aiming for when they're managing their woodlands. And if everyone does that, then we will be in a much better position. So yes, increasing woodland biodiversity is through proper management, essentially. And so just a quick recap. Most woodlands and woodland biodiversity are historically adapted to being managed. They need a certain amount of light. Woodland biodiversity has dramatically declined due to lack of appropriate management. The best way to help woodland biodiversity is to find out what woodland types you've got on your site. Is it upland oak woodland? Is it lowland wet woodland? Is it ancient woodland? Is it conifer plantation? And then find out via that tool I just showed you, the Woodland Wildlife Toolkit, what's meant to be there and how you can help it thrive. But ultimately, actively manage the woodland, do a little bit of thinning, do a little bit of felling, create some variability, get a woodland management plan in place, and do it to the UK Forestry Standard. And if everybody does that, if you remember this pie chart here on the left from earlier, then the grey area will decrease. It'll go the other way. We'll get more green. It's more management being registered, and we know what's going on. And that's not to do it in a sort of sneaky, oh, we're going to keep an eye on you governmental type thing. It really is helpful to know how many people are managing their woodlands well, because it means that policy and grants can then be focused to where they need to be focused. So it would be really helpful. Yes, manage your forest for resilience is the buzz saying really from this. So back to that question, which one would you go for? I mean, everyone's free to choose their own way of managing their woodland. Each woodland is different, and there will be species that need a particular type of management regime, and that may well be dense dark forest, with loads of deadwood and not loads of light if it's stag beetle or the sort of invertebrates. But generally, on the whole, a certain amount of light and variability is needed in UK woodlands. There's a load of resources here in the presentation, and I know that this is going online, so hopefully you can click on those links and follow those at your own leisure, and hopefully they'll be able to take you to some of the useful things I've talked about today, and also point you in the right direction for managing your woodlands. Particularly number 9 at the bottom, the Royal Forestry Society publication there on managing for resilience. There's 2 documents there. There's one document with a load of case studies about what people have been doing around the country, and there's also a load of other resources you can then go and follow and read up about. So please do go and look at those. And that is pretty much me done.
Thank you very much, Graham. That was fantastic. What I think I might do, as we've got 2 speakers, and we don't normally do it this way around, but I might open it up just for a short break to allow anybody to answer any of the 2 questions that you posed throughout the throughout your talk on biodiversity and on even the image of what's wrong with it, what their feelings are towards it, because I can see there's a couple of questions. So just going to ask out now, does anybody have anything that they want to ask Graham at this stage? And if you do, feel free to unmute yourself and fire away.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask you a question.
Hello, hi.
Hi. You mentioned about the active treatment of Ash Dieback. Could you describe that? Describe
the active treatment?
How you actually treat Ash Dieback?
Well, not actually. So not in terms of not treating the tree as such. So the response to treating Ash Dieback is basically depending on where it is in the woodland. So Ash Dieback, if you've got trees of Ash Dieback and they're near property or near rights of way roads, then you'll be looking to take them down to remove that risk. If they're in the middle of the woodlands, less of an issue. Maybe just let them go ahead and do their thing. Now there has been a bit of, when Ash Dieback first started appearing and people were getting very concerned about it, there was a knee-jerk reaction to go out and fell everything, get rid of ash completely. And actually, the best thing that can happen, unless you're in a situation where, you know, a dead and dangerous tree is going to fall on property, probably the best thing to do is let it go through the motions of falling over in the wood, and the new shoots coming through, so new saplings trying to come through, because you're actually what you're allowing ash to do is go through regenerating the presence of the pathogen, so that eventually it builds up its own resistance. And actually, ash compared to a lot of our trees has a lot of genetic diversity built within it. So actually, I think we will be in a better position than we initially thought with ash. It won't probably be to the same dominance that it is now, but it will be there, hopefully in better quantity than elm will be. But that's probably the best thing to do is know the signs and symptoms of what Ash Dieback looks like on your land. Know that some of them are actually showing tolerance on what that looks like, because you don't want to cut those ones down, and leave some of them in the canopy if you can, essentially. But yes, in terms of treatment, there isn't some, you know, cost-effective magic injection to put in every single tree. And I think the tendency, particularly with Ash Dieback, is people, the amount of times I get asked by people, what do I replace ash with? And I'm like, well, it's not just one species. You shouldn't focus just on, you know, managing your woodland for one species. Hopefully what people have grasped from tonight is you're managing for a range of species. And yes, respond to the Ash Dieback in your woodland, but you know, if you can focus on a lot of other things as well, your woodland will generally be healthier. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a little ash that's got Ash Dieback, but at the moment I've just been leaving it alone and letting other stuff come through, and it seems to be doing that. And some of the trees are surviving. So yeah,
no, I mean that's a good way to think about it. I think that, you know, people were at the rush to pull it all out and start again. I mean, you know, I know some people that I've seen woodlands where, you know, they were planted for the millennium 20 odd years ago, and they put larch and ash together, which is catastrophic because both have got horrendous diseases and both of them all died. And they planted that with the intention of it being a timber crop in the future. And obviously in that instance, you might want to think about felling it all and start again. But, you know, for most people with small woodlands generally, you know, if the ash isn't going to fall over and hit something or hurt somebody, then just leave it to get on and do its own thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chess. Are there any other questions from the floor for Graham? Graham, there's a question here that I'll read out for you. Do you know the general state of management of publicly, i.e. local authority owned woodland, please?
So local authority woodland is included in the statistic around privately owned woodland, so it's not on the public estate in the sense that it is owned by the state. So state-owned woodland is managed by Forestry England, Natural Resources Wales and Forestry Scotland, so anything that isn't local authority and isn't owned privately is generally in good condition, because it's being managed by to the UK Forestry Standard under a woodland management plan, and they have statutory, you know, targets to meet to improve the value of that woodland. So I'd rather suspect, without having the data to hand, because I don't think there has been a nationwide survey of local authority woodlands, but based on my experience of visiting, you know, woodlands around the country owned by by private landowners and local authority, yeah, they're not in great condition effectively, and they simply don't have the resources to manage those woodlands as effectively as they could do. And so, you know, local authorities that own woodlands are relying on local partnerships being developed with, you know, community volunteers, charities coming together and doing what they can to kind of get things moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. And I think before we move over to Russell, we'll throw one more question in, which I picked from the chat. Why are you against non-native species? Isn't that part of biodiversity?
Why am I against? That's a very good question. I'm against non-native species because quite a lot of them generally cause a lot of problems. for our existing native biodiversity. So deer, for example, muntjac, is a specialist grazer on ancient woodland plants. It's causing havoc with our ability to regenerate trees, seedlings, and ancient woodland flowers in our native woodlands. And if we could reduce the numbers of that particular species, for example, our woodlands will be in much better condition than they currently are. So if you walk around woodlands, most of the time you see loads of big trees. There's very little else coming through from the woodland floor, and that might be fine for now, but in about 100 years' time, when all the old trees start falling over, they're not being replaced by anything, because between the muntjac, great, and various other species, as well as native species being overpopulated deer-wise, they get to a certain age, even if they do get away from the deer, 12 to 15 years, and then the grey squirrel come and strip all the bark and kill the tree off. So grey squirrel and muntjac and other overpopulation of deer is two of the biggest threats facing our woodlands, and they are both non-native invasive species that are doing real harm to our woodlands, and that is why I am passionately against them, because just those two species alone are causing havoc with a greater range of species and the actual condition of our woodlands, so they have no place really.
Thank you very much, Graham. Appreciate that. If you have any more questions for Graham, please, as I said earlier, drop them in the chat or wait until the end, and we'll take them during the Q&A after Russell. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Russell Critchley from Deadwood.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me, Connor?
Yep.
Fantastic. First off, thank you very, very much, Graham, for that. That's a very informative presentation, and also that's some fantastic hurdle making. I imagine you've been working alongside Brian Williamson with doing clefting like that. So again, thank you, Sarah, Connor from CPRE for putting this on, and thank you very much for everyone for attending tonight. One of the things I'd like to start off before I start my presentation is a quote from Leopold. Might be familiar to you for anyone who's read it. It's I've read many definitions of what is a conservationist, but I suspect the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe. And you can take that as you will. You can also write it with a bill hook, or you can also write it with a chainsaw if you need to. So I will share my screen out, if you excuse me. Let's do that. Fantastic. Is that coming up for everybody?
Yep, that's coming up fine.
Wonderful. And if anyone's familiar with that picture, it might be because you've read Oliver Rackham's History of the Countryside. Now, if you've not read that, this is the Bible for historic woodland and countryside management. And it's one of the things that I base a lot of my work on, as well as many other authors as well. So definitely read that if you get the chance. So I run, so my name's Russell Critchley, and I run a management company in Nottinghamshire called Deadwood. And our ethos is to enhance biodiversity through traditional countryside and woodland management. So our services include hedgelaying, woodland management and consultancy, access, both their management and creation, watercourse management, and of course coppicing and coppice products. And as of later this year, hopefully, if you look at the bottom of your right of the screen, we'll be getting our hands on one of those, which is a low impact forwarder. So really light on the woodland floor, very little ground disturbance, and a very handy bit of kit that will save my knees and my back in the future. I believe that managing hedges and woodland is one of the true few symbiotic relationships we can have with the natural world. And by symbiotic, I mean in return for timber or for stock proofing, we can create these diverse and highly functional ecosystems. So the question is, how do we encourage the spread of woodland and, of course, hedgerow biodiversity across the landscape? And I believe this has been covered a lot in previous talks. And the simple answer is more and better manage hedgerows and woodlands. But the important thing to understand when enhancing biodiversity is that biodiversity is most abundant where two ecosystems meet. So with that in mind, here are the 5 topics I wish to discuss with you tonight. And these are wood banks and woodland edges, access and across the landscape, Woodland creation, so we're going to look at regeneration recolonization versus planting, agroforestry, and I'll touch very briefly on water as well. So I understand these are very, very broad topics, but I will try and stay as true to the theme of hedgerows where possible. One further saying I'd like you to keep in mind tonight is, as Graham has touched on, light is life, and this principle is especially important in woodlands, as almost all our woodland species thrive in well-lit and open areas. I'm going to keep quoting Leopold because I can. So how about this one? Land is not merely soil, it is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants and animals. Again, you read a Sand County Almanac, it's absolutely wonderful reading. So wood banks and woodland edges. So a wood bank is a feature of a woodland. It's built to retain livestock or define boundaries. So here is a good example of one down here. We've got this ditch, and ordinarily there would be a hedge like this one that I've created along there to retain the livestock. But often wood banks and the edges of woodland, many of our ancient woodlands particularly have over the years become what's called plantations on ancient woodland sites, otherwise known as paws, or either that they've been felled and restocked with non-native species. So more than often, the woodland edges and the banks are left alone as to prevent wind throw or just to keep the woodland looking pretty. And this means a lot of the edges of ancient woodlands are essentially echoes of their silvicultural history. So in my view, it's essential that we manage our wood banks and their edges to look after them for future management, but also for planting inspiration for new woodland and existing woodland. They really are vital seed banks of both canopy and understory plants. So this diagram below is a good guide to how to manage a woodland edge. This series of niche habitats and different rotations of management, and of course, importantly, light, enhances biodiversity and its transition between the neighbouring land and the woodland. And I'll talk about how that's managed in a little bit, because I'm going to jump straight onto access. Now, access is definitely one of the most important features of a woodland. It allows for the woodland to be managed. And I'll point out this at this stage, the pictures on the right-hand side, you do not need a tarmac driveway running through your woodland. A simple track or two paths of coarse stone is often sufficient for low impact forestry equipment, especially if they are well drained. So incorporating a single or a double ditch system either side of a raised track is very, very effective and will keep the track dry and accessible throughout the winter months when you're going to be managing it. These raised tracks, they can also be absolute hotspots for wildlife, especially when you manage them in a similar fashion to the woodland edge. And this is known as scalloping. So scalloping, again, just like the woodland edge, is a series of rotational management along the edge of a track or a ride. So a ride itself may be cut once or twice a year. Immediately next to that, it can be a patch of long grass that can be cut every year, and next to that can be a series of small low-lying scrubs that can be cut every, say, 2 or 3 years. And then after that, you can have a series of coppice stools or pollards that you can cut every 7 to 20, 30 years, depending on what you want to use the product for. Now, scallops, they want to be about 50 meters long and 20 meters wide to letting enough light in and enhancing the biodiversity within that area. And a well-managed woodland will have numerous scallops, all managed at different intervals. So you have this mosaic of different tree heights and different habitats, and it makes a very, very diverse woodland indeed. So an example of scallops enhancing biodiversity is the case of the checkered skipper butterfly. Now, this species of butterfly actually went extinct in England back in the 1970s. It clung onto the bits of Scotland and still does to this day. But one of the main reasons why this species went extinct is habitat loss, changes to its habitat, and woodland fragmentation. And also, as Graham touched on, the loss of a lot of management of woodlands, particularly smaller woodlands. So a few years ago, Butterfly Conservation, along with Back from the Brink project, undertook a series of management within fine shade wood and adjoining woodland, creating scallops and ride management that favoured the light favouring species of purple moorgrass and wood smallweed that the larvae this butterfly feeds on. Now, one thing that a lot of people think about when they think of butterflies is, you know, it's important to have pollinating plants, where in fact the larval stage, the stuff the larvae feed on, is just as or if not more important than pollinating plants. So just moving on. So after it was reintroduced into a secret location somewhere in Fine Shade Woods, annual reports noted increased sightings around Fine Shade and adjoining woodlands. So conservation projects like this are fantastic, especially ones that target a poster child species, because such as butterflies, because it often has repercussions and positive repercussions for other species that occupy similar niches, so other light-loving woodland species. So, and also it's worth noting that scalloping and edge management doesn't have to be limited to woodlands, particularly in this country where we have a lot of cycle paths, footpaths, bridleways, even roads. A lot of these can suffer from pretty dense overshading, and I'd be very interested to see more cases of people incorporating woodland management techniques into areas like this to try and enhance biodiversity. So moving on. Onto a very, very relevant topic of woodland creation. It's very hot at the moment. So I want to look at planting versus natural regeneration. It's worth, and also a note on historic woodland cover within this country. So in 1066, the Domesday Book recorded that 15% of England was wooded, and that includes wood pasture. As of March 2020, we think that around 13% of woodland of the UK is covered, of England is covered by woodland. You'll bear with me, actually, I'll have to check the statistics on that, whether that's UK or England. Forgive me on my sources. Essentially, what my point is the fact that as many as 1,000 years ago, very, very little of England was actually wooded, yet we're seeing dramatic decreases in biodiversity. So the question is why? I'd also like to point out another quote. This isn't Leopold or Rackham or anyone like that. This is, I think this is the Forestry Commission, an old saying of the right tree and the right place. And I'll explain a bit further about that why. So woodland planting. Now, first off, I'd like to say that the current tree planting targets are ambitious, but a little bit flawed. Now, I could talk all day about how not enough focus is given to management of woodlands and new woodlands and existing woodlands, and how we're too reliant on importing foreign trees with foreign diseases, how trees are planted in completely inappropriate locations, how little mind is paid to invasive deer and squirrel and plant species, how we build and burn imported timber while 50% of our woodlands or more go unmanaged, and how instead of woodlands we are planting fields of plastic trees that don't, field of plastic that don't biodegrade. On that note, there's a link there to the Woodland Trust, who have created a list of plastic-free tree guards, and I know Graham actually used some of these, the easy tree variety, in some woodland creation or restocking. I'd be very intrigued to see how they're getting on. So in terms of biodiversity, young planted woodland is actually very, very good for biodiversity, but only for the first kind of 10, maybe 15 years, because after this, the canopy closes and very, very little light reaches the woodland floor. And you also have basically a monoculture of evenly aged trees. There's also a significant lack of deadwood, symbiotic fungi, and a range of other features that you would ordinarily find in any other aged woodland. Ultimately, tree planting is a positive thing. We need young woodlands to support the woodland economy, but at the same time, we need to focus on managing woodland habitat rather than just planting it. So moving on to the opposite of that, which is natural regeneration. First off, I'd like to point out that natural regeneration shouldn't really be confused with rewilding, which I think is a bit of a stupid term, because it implies that we're reverting landscapes back to the wildwood, like Graham was talking about, to pre-human history without any need for management or intervention. I think the better term here will be to use as wilding. Simply implies letting nature take its course without removing the opportunity to manage sensitively. Again, allowing land to naturally regenerate is a fantastic method of enhancing biodiversity, but it's not without its flaws. It's entirely dependent on the local seed bank. So without local woodlands, standard trees, or management, open ground can very quickly become an inaccessible thicket of bramble. And that deprives sunlight and other light-dependent species and young trees especially. The best middle ground, I believe, and I'm sure there's hundreds of terms for this, but I used the term assisted colonization. So creating new woodlands with locally sourced trees spaced to encourage both dense thickets as well as open woodland and glades, and letting nature run its course, and at the same time managing it as to how we'd want it. And as well as that, creating and maintaining important ecological features such as tracks, meadows, streams, ponds, hedges, and of course, Deadwood. So this assisted colonisation is best shown here in Treswell Wood, which is an ancient woodland, coppice woodland, which I work. And if you see in the middle of the woodland here, this is 2 areas of agricultural land that's been given over. The first here is a hay meadow, which is cut annually. And this over here is given over just to let the woodland take over. And in there is planted a few oaks, a few bits of hazel, very, very sparsely, just to try and encourage young trees to grow around it. And the woodland edge is very much creeping out as well. There's a few ponds in there as well, which in the summer, this place is absolutely teeming with pollinators because there is a cowslip and wood anemone creeping in from the woodland edge. Orchids and primroses, bramble and everything. It's a really, really diverse environment. The ponds are teeming with great crested newts. There's raptors and owls. It really is a wonderful, wonderful place just to sit and admire this wonderful, wonderful landscape. So, as we're talking about tree planting, I'm going to talk very quickly about deer. Now, as Graham said, we're in the middle of a deer population explosion, and it's having massive repercussions on woodland growth, especially for trees and ground flora. And there are alternatives to plastic tree guards, further to the ones I've mentioned earlier. In fact, what I will do is I'll show very, very briefly let me see if I can find this, a video. This is Hugh and Carolyn in Rawhall Wood in Northamptonshire. They manage this wonderful, wonderful hazel coppice. And what they do, they take the arisings, which basically leftovers from the woodland floor that can't be used into anything, and then they pack it into these wonderful dead hedges, which are great for biodiversity. They
Just explain to us what you're doing, Caroline.
I'll let Caroline take the rest.
Bundle of brash in between the 2 existing stakes that are in the hedge, and I'm throwing it down and into the hedge. You're keeping space at the bottom because you really want to see the bottom line. You're going to keep rabbits, hare, muntjac, everything out for as long as you can. And we're taking these stakes that don't quite make hedging stakes, and you're threading it into the existing hedge down, and then slightly pushing it into the hedged place.
So yeah, that's Carolyn explaining their method of dead hedging. It's been developed over many, many years, and it's incredibly effective at keeping out deer. We're back to the same place. Fantastic. And again, it's just a wonderful, wonderful habitat. It's full of amphibians and insects and stag beetles and all the rest. And further to that, the arisings from things like forestry operations like thinning and felling, if you have a small forwarder, like we're hoping to have, you can also create these habitats as well using that with material that would have otherwise gone into windrows. On top of that, Ben Law, who you may be familiar with, who was on Grand Designs, is a very, very gifted roundwood worker, has developed this, which is a cleft sweet chestnut deer fence. And I think the other alternative to the problem of deer is venison is delicious. Venison Wellington with wild mushroom duxelle. Made it at Christmas, went down an absolute treat. Okay. Right, I'm going to very, very briefly touch on agroforestry, as it's such a massive and varied topic, but it's such an overlooked form of land use, yet holds so much potential. Much of our livestock today, be it cattle or pigs, they all evolved from woodland species, and woodlands once even documented for how many swine they contained. So on hot days or in the middle of a blizzard, livestock depend on trees and hedges for shelter and also for food. Now, pollarding trees for fodder is a tradition that goes back millennia, and Shropshire has some really, really wonderful ancient pollards of holly that were once used to feed livestock. Holly, by the way, is fantastic for sick animals as well, because it's very, very high in nutrients, vitamins, and particularly vitamin C. So it stands to reason that with all the benefits of that agroforestry brings, be it meeting tree planting targets, landscape biodiversity, connectivity, or animal welfare, why is so little mentioned of it? And I'd be very, very keen to see more agroforestry schemes developing in the future. Historic use of agroforestry. This is the Doomsday map of the village of Laxton. Now, if anyone's familiar with Laxton, you'll know it's the last working open field or strip farming system in England. Now, it's worth noting that strip farming has no ecological benefit whatsoever, or very, very little. But if we look at this map, in amongst all is that Westfield? No, that's Eastfield. And Westfield over here, and the other strip farming bits of strip farming, we have dots of woodland, new woodland, and of course wood pasture as well. So here and amongst there'll be loads of hedges as well. This really is an incredibly diverse landscape, despite having these great big swaths of open field here. And wood pasture, I think, particularly holds so much potential, especially in terms of meeting tree planting targets that seem so important these days. Furthermore, it's worth noting that each farm, now the village is, you can't quite see it, it's just running down here. Each of the farms that were on this village each had their own orchard. And orchards really are havens of biodiversity, but are in massive decline, mostly because of development or neglect. In fact, I recall hearing on the radio that an area of orchard the size of the Isle of Wight has been lost since 1900. So please go forth, plant fruit trees. Finally, I want to very, very briefly discuss water, specifically ponds. I could talk all day about watercourses, but I'll target ponds for this evening. Ponds are incredible source of biodiversity. They're their own ecosystem, but they are incredibly short-lived entities. As vegetation grows up around it, light diminishes, as does wind circulation, which is very, very important for oxygenation. And as the light decreases, so does vegetation growth. So a shaded pond will very, very quickly fill with sediment, with leaf litter, and this is not broken down because of the lack of plants. And the result is a very, very stagnant pool with very little ecological benefit. So anyone looking to maintain or build a pond, my advice is to dig deep and wide, encourage a variety of species and tree species and tree heights around the water to allow shading, but also to simultaneously manage light and open spaces for low-lying vegetation growth and wind circulation. Now, this is one of several ponds that we managed a couple of years ago. So this section around here where we put some chestnut fencing was absolutely overrun up to about here with overhanging willow and silver birch, and underneath there was absolutely no plant growth whatsoever. Furthermore, because this is the kind of northeast boundary of the pond, the prevailing winds were pushing leaf litter and debris from the southwest and collecting here. So here was actually 6 foot of silt. It was a proper death trap, and it was we needed to sort something out quickly. So these trees were all felled and all the willows pollarded. And then what we did, we installed some sweet chestnut stakes and faggots, otherwise known as fascines, which are bundles of twigs from my coppice woodland, which is all hazel. And then we installed, let's go back a bit. We installed this, which is coir matting, which is coconut husk pre-planted with native species such as irises and forget-me-nots and all other wonderful flowering species. And this really has just made such a massive impact on the pond itself. The water's much clearer. There's much more insect and bird life around. It is a very, very pretty spot to be. Anyway, I could talk about watercourses all evening long. However, I'm just going to leave you on one quote from a chap called Rob Atkinson, who is an ecologist and coppice worker who helped restore Treswell Wood, where I source all my hazel from today. And it's as rare as dormice and nightjars are, none is rarer than the coppice worker. There is no more important keystone species in a wood. That about wraps me up. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Russell. That was a fantastic talk and so insightful. Thank you for the video as well. It's always very helpful to see some practical application of what we're talking about. we've picked up some questions through the chat as you've been going along. I think I'll leave the deer population question for Graham. I think that came in just after we closed Graham's talk. Could you expand on your comment on rewilding? Would you say assisted management is better than natural regeneration in all cases?
I tell you what, we were discussing this earlier actually. The term of wilding, regeneration, it's so open to interpretation. There's so many variables involved, and you know, I could speak all evening about it. I will go back to my point of the right tree and the right place. I think, and also creating woodland, not just for filling it with trees to meet tree planting targets, to create, as Graham said, a woodland resource that's future-proof and that's resilient. So a range of species. So if I were to take a bare strip of land in the middle of nowhere, I'd say, right, we'll plant this up here with this and this here and mix it up. And in the future, we'll coppice and we'll do continuous cover forestry and then leave a bit of plantation of softwood over there, create this dynamic habitat. If in the case of Treswell Wood, where you've got an ancient woodland right next door, which is a valuable timber resource and seed bank, let it seed out, let it do its own thing. I think it's so up to variable. So again, back onto that point, right tree, right place. And yeah, you use your best knowledge to the best of your ability.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the floor from anybody for Russell? If there are, please feel free to unmute yourself. Oscar?
Yeah, hey. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, sweet. So yeah, I was just really interested on your interpretation of agroforestry and sort of a management of forests by using species that can sort of, like pigs, etc., maybe cows, then go into a woodland. And this is very different. I'm from Australia, and it's very different to how we would do it, where in Australia we'd cut off any ungulates going into a woodland because the system is just not co-adapted at all. And feral horses in Kosciuszko National Park, they destroy the landscape, and it's really precious peat bogs and swamps, etc. And that was my question to you. Wouldn't you say that if you put pigs or cows into an ancient forest, that they're going to do similar things to that of deer, and strip and remove sensitive flora within that landscape?
It's a very good question, actually. One thing I was discussing with one of my clients earlier, who I put in a load of fencing so that he could keep pigs within his woodland. They were in there for about 6 weeks before he decided to get rid of them because they caused that much damage. That said, they were saddlebacks, which are notorious for kind of being demolition within a woodland. So firstly, you'd think about the species that you're putting in there. You wouldn't put saddlebacks in a woodland, for example. Wild boar, they're much more adapted in there. And again, you've got to consider things like, as Graham was saying, population. 2 pigs in half an acre of woodland are going to destroy the place. 2 pigs in 20 acres of woodland, they're going to make very, very little difference at all. It's worth noting they will eat the bluebells though. So I think it's a case of keeping an eye on populations. Now, agroforestry, I think it really has fallen out of favour to the point where we've lost quite a lot of knowledge on it. But there are cases of where it's being brought back. I know there's a chap up in the Lake District who is essentially, I think it's the Lakes Free Range Egg Company or something. He works, he's developed. Basically, put a load of trees down, chickens underneath, everybody's happy, but it's new woodland. So what that would be the case of in ancient woodland, I'm not sure. And particularly over here, where I live, right next to Sherwood Forest, and particularly next door to Sherwood Forest, which is, what's the nature reserve called? For the life of me, I can't remember. Anyway, it's very much more an idea of what Sherwood Forest actually looked like. You think big oaks and old trees for Sherwood Forest, but actually it was a lot of open heathland. And to maintain that open heathland, you graze a lot of longhorn cattle on there. Again, it's about population, keeping an eye on the environment, what kind of environment you're trying to create. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great.
I was just, if you don't mind me butting in, I was just going to add, because I'm down in the Forest of Dean here, we do have wild boar, which obviously originally released, and the populations are pretty big down here, and if you drive around at night, it can be quite a scary thing to see a troop of them suddenly spring out from the woodlands and going across the road. They're big beasts, and they do an incredible amount of damage to sort of roadside verge habitat on the edge of woodlands, and sort of open space in woodlands. It's like a JCB's been through there. You know, yeah, it's down to species and also density, but as Russell was saying, but yeah, it's quite. Until I moved down here, I didn't actually appreciate kind of what they can do. They're the kind of in terms of earth moving, it's quite incredible.
Yeah, as I say, the agroforestry is it's the agro is a very, very important part in that. It's you're using the woodland to rear livestock, and at the end of the day, I say wild boar, venison, cow, whatever. It's delicious, and it's there to serve a purpose.
Thank you. I've got another comment and question here. These two talks have really impressed upon the role of woodland management, coppicing, etc. What would have naturally filled that niche in primary woodland, if at all?
You want to take this one, Graham?
Well, you're batting over to me, are you? Okay.
Yeah, well, by all means.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a concept called VeraCycle, which is basically coppicing is sort of like taking on board the concept of a VeraCycle in more intensity, if that makes sense. So a VeraCycle is basically where something happens to a tree, gets hit by lightning, or it dies and falls over. It creates a little niche, a little gap. Things grow up around to fill that gap, and that goes on in a forest. All over, but on a kind of a relatively small scale. And since humans started intervening on a massive scale 6,000 years ago, you know, that we basically started that en masse, so creating bigger gaps. Things became adapted to that. But what it would have, I suppose, to try and answer that question is, you're talking about effectively two different management regimes. One is quite interventionist, one is basically it's doing its own thing and everything's sort of in some sort of balance with megafauna. You know, there would have been beavers, wolves, boar, all sorts of things roaming around, doing their own little thing, creating little niches, but everything would have been in balance under generally what would have been a high closed canopy with little gaps in it. So I don't think we can sort of try and equate one to the other in terms of, you know, what would have been the natural equivalent to what humans were doing, because what humans were doing was obviously not being done to that scale by anything natural. It was on a much smaller scale. So it is a good question, but I don't think my inclination is to say there was no natural equivalent on that scale, really. It would have been megafauna doing things on a smaller scale, creating those gaps, and natural incidents like lightning strike, or, you know, particular disease hitting a tree and it falling over a group of trees, that kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Graham.
I'd certainly agree there. Again, if you refer to Rackham, there's a cracking chapter in there about all the megafauna that we've lost. Aurochs, beaver, although recently around me they've introduced them back into the Idle Valley. Quite a lot of places around the country as well. I'm going to hopefully they won't replace coppice workers, but yeah, as I say, and also especially for apex predators, wolves, lynx, etc. They would have ordinarily kept deer populations under control, whereas nowadays there's nothing in there, with the exceptions of humans, that can really intervene with that.
While on regarding invasive species, I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this question, but here we go. Grey squirrels are known to cause horrendous damage to trees in a forestry context. Do they have this impact upon forest biodiversity too? And do red squirrels also have this negative impact, or do their benefits outweigh any negatives they have?
I'll take that, Graham, as a batter.
Yeah, go for it. I was going to say, go for it.
I mean, obviously before grey squirrels were introduced, I think it was late 18th or 19th century, there were actually bounties on red squirrels within woodlands, because they will cause damage as well, red squirrels, but obviously the population shrunk to the stage where there's so few of them left, it matters not at all. Yeah, so sorry, could you go back to the original question? I got lost in woodland history there. So
no problem. Go back to the original question. Grey squirrels are known to cause horrendous damage to trees in a forestry context. Do they have this impact upon forest biodiversity too? and then goes over to ask me about the red squirrel bit in a minute.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think I've covered the red squirrel side of things. So the greys, yes, they do a lot of bark stripping. They cause a lot of tree damage, particularly in high densities. The fact is they are a much bigger predator than the red squirrel as well. So people say to me, "Oh, no, I'm not fussed about squirrels. I like petting them at centre parks and stuff." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, I prefer songbirds in my woodlands, and that's a fact. They are a rat of the trees. They will go in and eat birds' eggs and young chicks." A lot of insects, and they're just general thugs of the woodland. Don't get me wrong, they're an introduced species trying their best to survive in what is otherwise not their natural habitat. But the problem is the amount of damage they're causing, particularly to a lot of our native species and also woodlands as well. They really, something serious does need to be done about it, and is so, but just not on a scale that's large enough.
Thank you. Matt from Wiltshire says, does anyone check for low-lying roost features, i.e. cracks, crevices, rot holes, etc., and retain some of these trees during thinning or coppicing practices? Do you know anybody who checks?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So so protected species, of which bats are, both their roost and the individual animal are protected, and that legislation operates independent of any other legislative requirements or process that you need to go through for consent. But the UK Forestry Standard, as I mentioned in my presentation, has a whole section in there about how you consider wildlife and biodiversity when you're undertaking forestry operations, and definitely one of them is checking trees for roost features, and if you think they're there, get someone to look at them who's a licensed bat worker, and there are guidance notes on how to do that for the forestry sector online. You can find them, but yeah, definitely protected species are a huge consideration in the work that we do. That's why I do the cutting over the winter, so that I'm not affecting nesting birds. But obviously, if I'm cutting down trees in the winter, I might be affecting hibernating bats. So, so I'm conscious of that too. So yeah, wildlife is a big consideration. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do when I'm managing woodland is benefit wildlife, but not if that means cutting down trees which they might be inhabiting. So I check them first. Yeah, that is a key consideration.
Thank you. Sarah from South Shropshire says that we are lucky enough to have a new wood of 900 trees planted on our land in 2020, around 30% hazel, 30% a sessile oak, and the rest a native mix. We would like to bring the hazel and perhaps other species into management. We don't yet have a woodland management plan. Here's the question: is that our next step, and how long approximately until we can start the cycle?
Do you want me to take that one, Graham?
Yeah, okay, go for
it. Woodland management plan, yes, by all means, do get stuck in it with it straight away. The great thing is woodland management plans, they're not as straight cut as everyone thinks. They're very, very flexible. If you decide not to fell one year, you can make a note of that. You're not under any obligation to do anything with it. So yeah, and one of the best kept secrets in forestry is the use of My Forest, which is a template for filling out your woodland management plan. By all means, have a go at using that if that's any use to you. In terms of managing the hazel, managing the woodland, it obviously depends on how old your woodland is. I tend to coppice hazel based on the rule of thumb. If it's thicker than your thumb, it should survive. Maybe a little bit thicker, especially if it's a young plant. But yeah, then the main focus is stopping predation. Make sure the deer stay off it. And then obviously make sure there's enough light coming into the canopy as well. Hazel coppice, you want to be working on no more than 20-25% tree cover. Like that includes pole trees and standard trees. It looks quite severe, but if you look at the photo that Graham put up earlier, and I did as well, in the winter it looks severe, but it really does encourage a lot of good straight growth that encourage coppice workers to come back into the woodland, lets light onto the floor. So yeah, keep your standard cover about 20%.
Thank you very much. And I think with that, we've kept within good time, I think. We've had plenty of questions. I'll wrap it up here by just really thanking yourselves, Russell and Graham. It's been great to hear about your work, what you're doing, and of course, steal all of your advice, which I'm sure you don't mind handing over. what we will do is, if anybody has missed anything during the talk, I know there was lots of links shared. We tried to keep as many links as we could in the chat, but obviously once this finishes, the chat will disappear. But if you want any of the links that we're talking about, please just get in contact with CPRE Shropshire. We've of course got Russell and Graham's details. I put their websites on the chat earlier as well, so please take a note of them. If there's anything you missed, please just ask us. It's all readily available to send to you. As I say, this video will be available on YouTube in due course. Well, hopefully this, as I say, this is our last hedgerow talk for phase 1 with CPRE Shropshire. As I said earlier, we have been successful enough in securing the funding for phase 2, so we'll be able to do more fantastic work. And we already talked earlier with Graham and Russell about having them come back for maybe slightly different talks in phase 2, and we would really love to get into more conversations with all of you, really about what we can do to, I was going to say rewild our countryside of woodlands, but that's not the word, wild them. Thank you again. Thank you very much. You've been fantastic. We've been CPRE, the Countryside Charity. Take care.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Cheers.